I always thought the craziest things in life happened in daylight. Big decisions, bad calls, wild ideas. But I was wrong. It's the night, when the streets are empty and the air grows heavy, that strange things start to happen. Max had called me up a few days ago about this new arcade, said he'd heard whispers about it around town. Midnight Arcade, they called it. The catch? It only opened after midnight. The whole thing felt like some kind of marketing stunt designed to hook people in by tapping into their curiosity. We weren't the kind of guys to fall for cheap tricks, but there was something different about this one. The more Max talked about it, the more intrigued I became. People were saying weird things about the place, about how people who went inside came back, changed, or didn't come back at all. It sounded like a ridiculous urban legend at first, but Max's excitement was contagious. Besides, it was just an arcade, right? It was 11:55 p.m. when Max and I stood in front of what was supposed to be the legendary Midnight Arcade. It was hard not to feel let down when we saw it. The building was nothing more than a decaying, boarded-up relic, standing against the cold night with a kind of sad loneliness. Its windows were clouded with dust, and the chipped bricks looked like they could crumble at any moment. It seemed impossible that this was the place everyone had been buzzing about for weeks. "Is this some kind of joke?" Max groaned, his breath puffing in the night air. He kicked at a loose rock on the sidewalk, clearly frustrated. "Who even sent us this address? This thing's a dump." I nodded, but something gnawed at me. The arcade was too famous, or rather infamous, to just be a hoax. People had talked about this place like it was a myth, something you didn't just stumble across. There were stories, wild ones, about what happened inside. But none of that seemed likely now, standing in front of a rotting, lifeless building. "Maybe it's just some elaborate prank," I muttered, already starting to turn away. "We should just go." Max shrugged and followed my lead, clearly disappointed. We'd driven out here in the middle of the night for nothing. As we began walking back toward the car, the air around us shifted. It was subtle at first, a quiet hum like the distant buzz of electricity. Then, from behind us, I saw it. A soft flickering glow reflecting off the pavement, growing brighter by the second. We stopped dead in our tracks. Slowly, we turned back toward the building, and what we saw left us both speechless. The abandoned structure was gone. In its place stood a glowing, vibrant arcade, like something straight out of an 80s fever dream. Neon lights bathed the entire building in shades of blue and pink, flickering in a rhythmic pattern that seemed to pulse with life. The sign overhead, which hadn't existed a moment ago, blazed with bright blue letters, Midnight Arcade. The lights danced along the walls, reflecting off the glass windows that were now perfectly clear. Inside, I could make out rows of arcade machines, all alive with sound and light. Max's face lit up with awe. "Dude, this is amazing. How'd they even do this? It's like some kind of crazy illusion." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A moment ago, the place was a decaying wreck, and now it looked like it had been plucked from a different dimension. But instead of asking questions, Max was already moving toward the entrance, the excitement bubbling out of him like a kid in a candy store. "Come on, Sam," he called back. "This is too cool. We can't pass this up." Despite the unsettling shift in reality, I found myself following him, curiosity pulling me closer to the door. The arcade seemed to pulse with energy, like it was alive, beckoning us inside. Once inside, the arcade was even more surreal. Rows upon rows of glowing machines lined the walls, each one buzzing with life. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and something metallic, like old coins. A nostalgic soundtrack of arcade beeps and blips filled the air, though no other players seemed to be inside. The machines were both retro and modern, a strange mix of the past and the present. It was a gamer's paradise, but there was something off. "Man, check this out," Max said, darting toward one of the machines. "They've got all kinds of games here." He didn't wait. He slid into the seat of an old racing game. The the screen flashing on as soon as his hands touched the wheel. I wanted to tell him to wait, to take a second to think about what just happened outside, but I kept quiet. Max had a way of diving headfirst into things without looking back. I leaned against one of the machines and watched as he started to play. The car roared to life on screen, hurtling down a neon-lit highway. Max grinned as he sped through the game, weaving in and out of traffic like a pro. For a moment, everything seemed normal, but then it started. At first I thought it was just my imagination. Max's grin faded slightly and his knuckles tightened around the wheel. His posture shifted, like he was uncomfortable, but he didn't stop playing. His car continued to swerve through traffic on the screen, but something was off about the way he was playing, like he was fighting against something invisible. "Max?" I called out, stepping closer. He didn't respond. His car swerved violently on the screen, smashing into a barrier. The words "Game Over" blinked in glaring red letters, but Max didn't move. His eyes were locked on the screen, wide and glassy. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Max!" I shouted, grabbing his shoulder. He snapped out of it, gasping as though he had just surfaced from underwater. His chest heaved as he looked around, disoriented. What? What just happened?" I didn't know how to respond. "You zoned out or something. You okay?" Before he could answer, the entire arcade dimmed. A low, mechanical hum filled the air, and every machine in the room powered down, their screens flickering to black. That's when it happened. A large screen in the center of the arcade, one I hadn't noticed before, flickered to life. The screen was old and grainy, like something from a decades-old computer, and blocky text appeared across it in a harsh green glow. "Rule 1. You must play the game you're drawn to." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. "Wait, what the hell?" I muttered, staring at the screen. Max's face paled as he took a step back. "Drawn to? I just picked a random game." The screen remained still for a moment, as if waiting for us to comprehend the rule, and then the text shifted again. "Rule 2. You must finish the game." Max rubbed his temple, looking uneasy. The realization sank in. He hadn't been drawn to the racing game. He had chosen it randomly, and he didn't finish it. The screen didn't wait for our response before shifting once more. "Rule 3. No second chances." A chill ran down my spine. The arcade felt different now, more oppressive, like the walls were closing in. I glanced at Max. "What does that mean? No second chances?" Max swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know, but I don't like this." "Rule 4. Never look away from the screen while playing a game." The moment the words appeared, something shifted in the air. The arcade lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. I suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. Rule 5. Never play a multiplayer game alone. I glanced at Max, trying to make sense of this rule. Play a multiplayer game alone? That doesn't even make sense. But Max wasn't paying attention to me anymore. His eyes were fixed on the screen, his breath coming faster now. Rule 6. You cannot leave until you've won at least one game. Escape before sunrise or you'll vanish with the arcade. Max turned to me, his face drained of color. "This isn't a joke, is it?" I shook my head, the weight of the rules sinking in. "I don't think it is." The moment the last rule flickered off the screen, Max and I stood frozen in place, the oppressive silence of the arcade settling around us like a thick fog. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I could feel it, the reality of what had just happened, of what we'd stepped into, sinking in like a lead weight. "Dude, this isn't right," Max muttered, his voice shaky. His wide eyes darted around the arcade, searching for an escape, for anything that could explain what was happening. "It's got to be some kind of joke, right? Maybe we're on camera, like a prank show?" But I could hear the tremble in his voice. He didn't believe it either. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. "I don't know, man. But whatever this is, we need to get out of here." Without thinking, we both bolted toward the front door. My shoes squeaked against the sticky linoleum as I reached for the handle and pulled with everything I had. Nothing. I tried again, wrenching the door as hard as I could, but it didn't even budge. The neon lights outside blinked mockingly through the reinforced glass, and no matter how hard I yanked, the door was as solid as concrete. "Come on," Max shouted, his voice tinged with panic. He slammed his shoulder against the door, gritting his teeth as he tried to force it open. This can't be happening. It was open before. I stepped back, my chest tightening with dread. It was happening. We were trapped. My hands were shaking now, the cool sweat on my palms making my skin clammy. "We need to think," I muttered, more to myself than to Max. "There's got to be another way out." But Max wasn't listening. He kept tugging at the door, his breathing getting faster and faster. "This isn't real," he said, almost like he was trying to convince himself. "It's some kind of setup, just a gimmick." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we were part of some elaborate, messed-up game. But the look on his face told me he knew the truth just as much as I did. The door wouldn't open. The arcade had locked us in. Suddenly, a high-pitched noise pierced through the silence. We both spun around, searching for the source. It was coming from deeper inside the arcade, where the machines stood in their eerie neon glow, flickering like they were alive. A multiplayer machine had come to life, its screen flashing wildly, casting strange shadows across the walls. The game's speakers blared to life, echoing through the empty room. A tinny jingle played over and over, growing louder, more insistent. The words "press start" blinked in sync with the flickering lights. Max and I exchanged a look. "No way," he whispered. "I'm not touching that thing." But we didn't have a choice. The words of the rules echoed in my mind, especially Rule 6. You cannot leave until you've won at least one game. The arcade had chosen us. It was drawing us toward the machine, pulling us into the game whether we liked it or not. "We have to," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have a choice." Max stared at the screen, his face pale. The flashing lights from the machine reflected in his wide eyes, making him look like a deer caught in headlights. "You saw what happened last time. I didn't even pick the right game. This isn't normal, Sam." "I know," I replied, stepping closer to the machine. The screen flickered more violently, the text blinking faster, urging us to sit down. "But if we don't play, we're not getting out of here." Max hesitated for a moment longer, then let out a shaky breath. "This is insane." "Yeah," I agreed. "But we've got to do it." The game in front of us was a racing game, but this wasn't the same one Max had played before. This machine was bigger, with 2 seats and 2 sets of controls. The title screen flickered to life in bright, flashing letters: Dual Race, Escape Velocity. Below it, pixelated cars revved their engines, waiting for us. Max and I slid into the seats reluctantly, our hands hovering over the controls. The arcade around us felt like it was watching, waiting. I could feel the weight of the machine pulling me in, like it wouldn't let go until we were fully committed. "You ready?" I asked, my voice trembling. Max shook his head. "Not even close." With a deep breath, I gripped the steering wheel and the game jolted to life. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The screen exploded with movement as our cars shot forward down the track. The visuals were disorienting, bright flashes of light, twisting roads that looped and spiraled like something out of a nightmare. I could hear Max's car revving beside mine, the sound of tires screeching against the digital pavement filling the air. But something wasn't right. As I sped down the track, I noticed familiar sights. The track warped, turning into something that resembled the roads in our town. It was as if the game was pulling pieces of reality into its twisted version of the world. Max and I weren't racing through some generic arcade landscape anymore. We were racing through memories. I swerved to avoid a sudden obstacle, an old playground I hadn't seen since childhood. The swings creaked in the wind, abandoned and eerie as I sped past. I could see Max's car ahead of me, weaving through obstacles with increasing panic. "Sam!" he shouted over the roar of the engines. "This is messed up. I know that place. That's my old school. I saw it too. The track was warping, reshaping itself into a distorted version of places we knew, places from our past. But something was wrong. Everything looked decayed, like it had been abandoned for years. The trees were twisted, the buildings crumbling. It was like the game was feeding off our memories and warping them into something nightmarish. The speed of the cars increased, and my heart raced with it. The turns became sharper, the obstacles more dangerous. My hands were sweating as I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to stay in control. But no matter how fast I went, the world around me continued to distort. And then, up ahead, I could see versions of myself, figures driving identical cars, racing alongside me. They looked like me, but their faces were twisted, warped into mocking grins. They were shadows of me, taunting me from the corners of my vision. Max's voice broke through the panic. "Sam, look out!" I barely had time to react before my car slammed into one of the figures. The impact shook the entire machine, and the screen flashed bright red as my car spiraled out of control. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt like I was being pulled out of my own body, like something else was trying to take control. The screen blinked. "You lose." The game froze, but I was still gripping the wheel. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. Slowly, I released my grip and turned to Max. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he let go of the controls. "What the hell just happened?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I saw myself out there." I nodded. I saw it too. Max slumped back in his seat. "We're screwed, Sam. This place, it's not normal." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were trapped in this nightmare, and the arcade was playing by its own twisted rules. The doors wouldn't budge, the games were rigged, and the morning was closing in fast. And we still had more games to play. My heart was still racing from the last game, as Max and I sat in the cold silence of the arcade. The screen in front of us blinked off, leaving us in the eerie glow of the neon lights. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were still shaking from gripping the wheel too tight. Max stared at the machine, his face pale. He wasn't saying anything. Hell, neither of us could make sense of what just happened. I stood up, legs weak, my knees shaking. As I took a step forward, a strange sensation washed over me. It was subtle at first, like a faint buzzing at the back of my skull, but then it spread through my body, crawling down my spine. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling intensified. My movements became stiff, jerky, as if I was fighting against something I couldn't see. "Sam, you alright?" Max asked, his voice tinged with panic. I wanted to respond. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that we'd figure this out, but the words wouldn't come. My body felt wrong. I tried to lift my arm, but it wouldn't listen. My legs moved on their own, pulling me toward the center of the arcade like I was being controlled by some invisible force. I was trapped in my own body. "Sam?" Max shouted, grabbing my shoulder, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even turn to look at him. My feet dragged me across the floor, step by step, my limbs stiff like a puppet on strings. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to fight back, but it was no use. I couldn't break free. It was like I was being taken over by the thing I saw in the game, the figure that looked just like me, the one that grinned at me from the shadows of the race. I walked in circles around the arcade, my arms twitching and my head jerking slightly with every step, like my body was glitching. For a few moments, I was nothing but a passenger in my own skin, watching helplessly as the arcade blurred around me, my vision flickering in and out. Then the control loosened. I stopped walking. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, my body my own again. My head spun as I lay there, trying to piece together what had just happened. I could still feel it, the presence of that shadow, lurking at the edges of my mind, but it had let go, for now. "Sam?" Max knelt beside me, his face white with fear. "What the hell was that? You were moving like you weren't even there." I shook my head. trying to catch my breath. I don't know. It felt like something was controlling me, like I wasn't in control anymore. I looked at him, panic tightening my chest. I didn't know what to think. We had to get out of here. Suddenly, a new sound echoed through the arcade. A soft, whispering voice coming from one of the darker corners of the room. I turned, my body still weak, and saw another machine lighting up. The title flashed on the screen in blocky letters, Whispers of the Woods. The whispers grew louder as I stared at the machine, the screen flickering with eerie images of a dense, shadowy forest. I didn't want to go near it. I didn't want to play, but the arcade had chosen, and the rules were clear. We had to play the game we were drawn to. Max looked at me, shaking his head. "You can't play that one, Sam, after what just happened." But we both knew I didn't have a choice. My body was already moving, dragging me toward the machine as though the arcade itself was pulling me in. I stepped up to the glowing screen, the whispers swirling around me like a cold wind. I could almost feel them crawling under my skin, urging me forward. I pressed start. Whispers of the Woods. The screen flickered, and the game began. It was a first-person perspective, my character standing in the middle of a dark, twisted forest. The trees loomed over me like jagged shadows, their branches twisting unnaturally, and the ground beneath me was covered in thick, dead leaves that crunched with every step. A soft wind blew through the trees, carrying faint, ghostly whispers that echoed in my ears. I started moving, the character moving sluggishly through the dense woods. The whispers grew louder, their words indistinct but unsettling. I couldn't see anything around me, just endless trees and the darkness that stretched between them. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows, lurking just out of sight. As I moved deeper into the forest, I spotted glowing eyes in the distance. They flickered between the trees, darting away the moment I tried to get a better look. The game's objective was simple enough: collect items and escape the woods. But every time I found something useful, like a flashlight or a map, it would disappear from my inventory as soon as I tried to use it, vanishing into thin air as if something was sabotaging me. The whispers followed me with every step, growing louder and more frantic. "Come closer," they urged. "You'll be safe here." I didn't trust the voices. I kept moving, searching for a way out, but the trees seemed to close in around me, and the glowing eyes drew closer, flickering in the periphery of my vision. I felt like I was being hunted, like whatever was in the forest was getting closer with every second. The game was playing with my mind, distorting my sense of direction. The whispers never stopped, always urging me towards something unseen, something lurking just beyond the trees. But I didn't follow them. I kept moving, kept searching for the exit. And then, I saw it. Some kind of beast stepped out from behind the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It was tall, standing on two legs, its body distorted, like it was flickering between realities. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as the beast moved toward me, its eyes locking onto mine. I ran, the forest twisted around me, the path shifting with every turn. I could hear the creature behind me, its footsteps silent, but its presence suffocating. The whispers screamed in my ears, but I kept running, kept dodging through the trees, searching for an escape. Finally, I saw a faint light in the distance, just beyond the trees. The exit. I sprinted toward it, my heart pounding in my chest, the creature still chasing me, its glowing eyes burning into my back. I burst through the trees and into the light. The game froze, the screen flickering once more before the words "You win" flashed in bright, mocking letters. I let out a shaky breath, stepping back from the machine, my legs weak and my mind spinning. Max rushed over, his face filled with concern. Did you win?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. "Yeah, I think so." Max was pacing nervously beside me, still shaken from what we'd been through, but trying to keep it together. I could barely focus, my mind still buzzing from the whispers and the tension in my body. But the rules were clear. We couldn't stop. We had to keep playing. As if on cue, another arcade machine came to life, its screen flickering with distorted images. The title on the screen blinked in jagged letters: Mirror Maze Madness. Max flinched when the machine powered up. He turned toward it reluctantly, his shoulders tense. I guess it's my turn now. I didn't say anything. We both knew he couldn't refuse. The arcade had chosen him, just like it had chosen me. The only way out was forward. Max walked over to the machine, glancing at me before taking a seat. He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the controls for a moment before he pressed Start. Mirror Maze Madness. The screen brightened, casting a harsh glow across Max's face as the game loaded. The view on the screen was from a first-person perspective, the player character standing at the entrance to a maze made entirely of mirrors. The reflective surfaces stretched out endlessly in every direction, creating a confusing labyrinth of shimmering corridors. "This looks unsettling," Max muttered, gripping the joystick. As he started to move through the maze, the reflections in the mirrors flickered, lagging behind the player's movements. It wasn't immediate, just a slight delay, like the reflections were a few milliseconds off. But the longer Max played, the worse it got. At some point, his real-life reflection showed up in the mirrors of the game, and every time he moved, the reflections felt wrong. "This is weird," Max said, eyes fixed on the screen. "The reflections look like me." I watched as the reflections in the mirrors began to shift. In one corner of the screen, I saw his reflection grinning. His reflection raised its hand, as if waving him into a dead-end corridor. Max tensed. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice strained. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Just keep going." He hesitated for a second, but moved forward into the maze, dodging wrong turns and dead ends. The mirrors continued to warp, distorting his reflection in strange ways. Some of the reflections started beckoning him down wrong paths, their eyes locked onto his, their smiles widening as they gestured for him to follow. "They're trying to trick me," Max muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "They want me to take the wrong turn." As the maze twisted and looped in on itself, the reflections became more aggressive. One of them leaned close to the screen, its face twisted. It pressed its hands against the glass of the screen, like it was trying to reach through and pull Max into the maze, into the game. I stood to the side, watching the game unfold, my pulse still racing. Max kept his focus on the game, maneuvering through the maze. Some of the mirrors showed versions of him that looked older, more haggard, as if the game was aging him before my eyes. Then, without warning, Max glanced over at me, just for a second. I was standing to his right, just out of his line of sight. His face immediately twisted in fear. "Sam!" he shouted, his voice trembling. What is it?" He didn't respond at first, his eyes wide with terror. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking past me. I turned around, following his gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the empty arcade and the neon lights blinking softly in the dark. "There was something behind you," Max whispered, his voice barely audible. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Don't look away from the screen," I whispered, remembering the rule. "Just finish the game. Keep your eyes on the screen." Max nodded, his hands trembling as he gripped the controls again. He forced his attention back to the game, his eyes glued to the flickering mirrors in front of him. As he navigated the final twists and turns of the maze, his reflections started to lag further behind. They grinned wickedly, beckoning him into a corner, but Max didn't follow. He kept his focus, dodging dead ends. Finally, he reached the exit. The screen flashed. "You win," and the game froze. Max let out a shaky breath and leaned back in his seat, his face pale. "I made it," he whispered, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. "I got out." I watched him closely, but the relief I expected didn't come. There was something off in his expression, something that told me the game wasn't done with him. As Max stood up from the machine, I noticed him glance toward one of the reflective surfaces nearby, the glass of one of the arcade's machines. His face went pale again. "Sam," he whispered. "Look." I followed his gaze, staring at the glass. At first it seemed normal, but then I saw it. In the reflection, something was wrong. Max's reflection was smiling at us, even though the real Max wasn't. The grin was faint, but it was there, a twisted, unnatural smile. It flickered for just a second, then vanished as soon as I blinked. Max's eyes darted to every reflective surface around us. The glass of the machines, the windows, anything that cast a reflection. His reflection was still there, still twisted, still wrong. "It's following me," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I keep seeing it in the reflections. It's not me." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The arcade was playing with us, warping reality, and I knew that whatever Max saw in those mirrors wasn't just his imagination. The games were bleeding into the real world, and I wasn't sure how much more we could take. I glanced at a dark corner of the arcade, and there it was, the creature from the Whispers of the Woods game. I could feel its presence in the room, lurking in the dark corners. I saw its faint glowing eyes, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that, if I looked too long, it would step out of the shadows and into the light. "Sam," Max whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do we do now?" I tried to focus, but the weight of the arcade pressed down on me. The rules had been clear. You must win the games to escape. We had each won a game. I had beaten the forest. Max had escaped the maze. By the logic of the rules, we should be able to leave. We should be able to walk out the door and never look back. Max moved toward the door, his steps cautious and slow. "Do you think it's over? Can we get out?" I wasn't sure, but we had to try. "Let's see," I said, my voice hoarse. We made our way to the exit, the neon lights flickering as we walked. Max reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped it. He pulled. Nothing. The door didn't move. "Damn it," Max muttered, yanking at the door harder, panic rising in his voice. "Why isn't it opening? We did what it wanted. We played the games." That's when it happened. A low hum filled the arcade, the lights dimming as the central screen in the room flickered back to life. The same blocky, retro text appeared, burning bright against the dark. "Final game." Max stepped back from the door, his eyes wide. "What the hell is this?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The rules had never said anything about a final game. I swallowed hard, the dread growing in the pit of my stomach. The text on the screen shifted, each word hitting like a hammer to my chest. "To escape, you must play one final game. Face your worst fears. Face the arcade." I glanced at Max. His face was drained of color, his fists clenched at his sides. "This can't be happening. We beat the game, Sam. We did everything we were supposed to do." But the arcade wasn't done with us. It wanted more. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, like the very walls were alive and closing in on us. The air around us felt heavy, electric, as if the arcade itself was shifting, preparing for the final showdown. The machines flickered in unison, and the shadows in the room seemed to ripple, as if something massive and dark was stirring beneath the surface of reality. The screen in front of us blinked again, the game loaded. The title flashed on the screen, The Final Test. The image that accompanied it sent chills down my spine, and then the lights went out. All at once, the arcade was plunged into total darkness. The hum of the machines died, replaced by an eerie, almost suffocating silence. For a moment, I thought I had gone deaf. There wasn't a single sound, not even our breathing. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing behind me in the pitch darkness. I spun around, eyes wide, but I couldn't see a thing. The darkness was absolute. My heart pounded in my chest. The footsteps stopped, and a distorted voice crackled to life. "You are the prey," the voice rasped, a warped, almost inhuman tone that made my skin crawl. "Survive for 1 hour." The air seemed to freeze. My mind raced. trying to comprehend what I had just heard. Before I could even respond, the voice crackled again, the static growing louder.
The hunt has begun.
Suddenly, a blinding light pierced through the darkness, but it wasn't coming from the arcade's machines. It was from the door, the same door that had been locked and wouldn't budge before. It was now wide open, leading out into the streets. But something was wrong. I bolted for the exit, my footsteps echoing off the arcade's walls. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The town was no longer the town I recognized. The streets looped in unnatural patterns, twisting back on themselves, buildings towering over me like looming, crooked giants. Streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, unnatural shadows across the ground. I glanced around trying to get my bearings, but the world refused to make sense. Every street I knew had become warped, elongated. The familiar landmarks twisted into grotesque versions of themselves. And the people. As I ran through the streets, I passed people who should have been familiar, people I had grown up with, but they were wrong. Their faces were turned around, staring at me over their shoulders while their bodies faced the opposite direction. Their mouths were open, wide, stretched impossibly far, as though trying to scream, but no sound came out. Behind me, I heard the footsteps again, this time faster, heavier. The pursuer. I didn't dare look back. I ran through the warped streets, the ground beneath my feet shifting like quicksand, each step harder than the last. I could hear it behind me, getting closer, the sound of something massive and relentless. As I rounded a corner, the world twisted again. The street in front of me looped back on itself, the buildings bending like they were made of liquid. My legs felt like lead, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, I was no longer outside. I found myself into my childhood home. The once familiar walls were cracked and decaying, the furniture warped and covered in dust. The photos on the walls showed twisted versions of my family, their faces blank with no features. I stumbled through the living room, my mind spinning. It was all wrong. Everything was wrong. I pushed forward, but the house twisted around me. The walls shifted, stretching into long, dark hallways. The whispers from the forest game echoed around me again, swirling in the air, growing louder with each step. My heart raced as I sprinted down the hall, the walls closing in. And then, I saw them. People from my past. People I hadn't seen in years. Old friends, teachers. They stood in the corners of the room, staring at me with blank, lifeless eyes. Their bodies were still, but their faces followed me, turning at impossible angles. I felt like I was suffocating. The twisted versions of the people I once knew seemed to close in on me, their eyes unblinking, their mouths silently gaping. And then I saw him. It looked like Max. He stood at the far end of the room, his back to me. But something was wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural. Slowly, he turned around, and when I saw his face, my blood ran cold. It was Max, but twisted. His eyes were missing, his mouth open, full of sharp, long, and thin teeth. The Max I knew was gone, replaced by something monstrous, something that wore his face like a mask. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps behind me grew louder, the presence of the pursuer closing in. I ran, bursting through the door of the house and back into the warped streets. The world around me twisted further, looping back on itself. No matter which way I turned, I ended up back where I started. Reality was collapsing. I could hear Max's voice behind me. No, not Max. The thing that had become Max. It was taunting me, its laughter echoing in my ears as the chase grew closer, more frantic. The twisted figures on the street turned to watch me, their eyes following my every move. The hour was almost up, and the pursuer was right behind me. Then, just as the terror reached its peak, everything stopped. The world went still. For a moment, I stood frozen, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The twisted figures around me melted away, the streets fading into darkness. I suddenly found myself in total darkness. The distorted voice crackled once more.
You survived.
The lights flickered back on, dim, flickering weakly like they were struggling to stay on. I was in an abandoned, crumbling building. The floor was covered in dust, and the walls were cracked, the paint peeling away in chunks. The arcade was gone. I turned, my heart still racing, trying to make sense of where I was. The door, the same one we had tried to escape through, was hanging open, leading out into the dim glow of the early morning light. "Max?" I called, my voice echoing in the empty room. There was no answer. Panic surged through me. I scanned the building frantically, my eyes darting from corner to corner. "Max, where are you?" But he was gone. I stumbled toward the exit, my legs weak, barely able to hold me up. I reached the doorway, stepping into the pale morning light. The world outside looked normal again, but the sense of dread remained. I turned back, staring at the decrepit building, the place that had once been the arcade. And then I saw it. Just for a second, in the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of someone standing around the side of the building, watching me. I froze. It was Max. Same face, no eyes, sharp, long teeth. And then he glitched out. He was gone. I haven't been back to that part of town since that night. When I tried to explain what happened to anyone, they looked at me like I was crazy. Some laughed, saying that building's been empty for years. But I know what I saw. I haven't heard from Max since that night. His phone is disconnected. No one's seen him. His family filed a missing persons report, but the police found nothing. It's like he just vanished. And maybe he did. Maybe the arcade took him. Sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint hum of the arcade machines. I'll glance in a mirror and see something behind me, just for a second, just a flicker. It's always him, Max, standing there watching me. The worst part? Sometimes I wonder if it's really him, or if it's something else. Something that followed me out. I don't go near mirrors anymore. And every night I check the clock, because midnight is coming.